The first time I understood what my sister Marley was really doing, I was 29 years old and standing barefoot in her kitchen at almost midnight, holding a mug of chamomile tea that had gone cold in my hands. She had just told me, in that steady voice she used when she wanted to be sure I heard her, that she wanted me to be her maid of honor. Not a bridesmaid. Not something folded politely into the wedding party with a softened title invented to spare everyone the discomfort of the truth. Maid of honor. She said the words the way our mother used to name things in the garden, quietly and with certainty, as if naming a thing correctly was itself a small act of devotion. And I remember that I didn't cry right away because the part of me that had spent almost 3 decades learning not to be caught wanting anything too much held very still, the way a rabbit holds still in tall grass, waiting to see if the shape moving toward it is a person or a shadow. Marley watched my face. She had always been able to read me, even in the years when I was almost unreadable to myself, and she reached across the counter and put her hand over mine, and she said, more softly, I already told Priya. I told her weeks ago. She understood. She sends her love. And then I did cry, but not the way people cry in films, not with any grace. I cried like a person who had been carrying a heavy coat through a long summer and had only just been told they were allowed to set it down. Before I go any further, I want to pause for a moment because a story like this deserves to be told to someone, not just at them, and if you are here listening to me piece together the truth of my life, then you are already part of it in a way I do not take for granted. I would love, if you feel like it, for you to tell me where you are in the world as you listen, the city or the town or the country where you happen to be sitting or walking or lying awake tonight, because it comforts me to imagine you somewhere specific, somewhere with weather and a kitchen and a window, rather than as an abstract audience. And if anything in what I say brushes up against something you have carried yourself, some small private memory or feeling you thought no one else would understand, I hope you'll leave a word or two behind, because I think we underestimate how much it matters to be gently seen by a stranger. I am not here to perform for you. I am here to remember out loud, and I would rather remember with you close by than alone. So let me go back further. Because Marley's words in that kitchen were not the beginning of anything, they were only the moment when many old, quiet things finally found a shape. I was born the second child in a family that valued composure the way other families value religion. My father was an accountant with an almost devotional relationship to order, a man who lined his shoes up at the door each night in the same sequence, work shoes on the left, weekend shoes on the right, house slippers between them, and my mother taught 7th grade English and believed, without ever saying so directly, that a well-mannered child was a form of art. Marley came first, 3 years ahead of me, dark-haired and watchful and easy in her body from the moment she could walk. And then there was me, and I was, by every visible measurement, the boy of the family. That is what the room said when I entered it. That is what the birthday card said, and the little cousin said, and the barber said when my mother brought me in every 6 weeks for the same tidy cut she had chosen without asking. And for a long time, I did not know that anything else was possible, because when a whole world tells you what you are, you don't argue with it. You just try to become fluent in the language it expects you to speak. The earliest memory I have of feeling out of alignment is not dramatic. It is almost embarrassing in how small it is. I was maybe 4, sitting on the bathroom rug while my mother helped Marley get ready for a cousin's baptism. Marley was in a pale yellow dress with a satin sash, and my mother was brushing her hair into 2 smooth wings and pinning them behind her ears with tiny pearl clips. I remember the smell of the hairspray, and the way the light came in through the frosted window and made a soft rectangle on the tile, and I remember watching my mother's hands and thinking, without any of the words for it yet, that I wished those hands were doing that to me. Not to my sister. To me. That was the whole thought. It came and went like a bird passing a window. But I remember, even then, feeling that I should not tell anyone about it, and the not telling was so instinctive that I do not think I ever really considered the alternative. Some children learn to hide before they learn to read, and I was one of them. Our house had a rhythm that I understood was mine, to fit into rather than to shape. On Sunday mornings, my father made pancakes in the shape of the first letter of each of our names. An M for Marley, a big loopy letter for me that I will not write out because that name belongs to a person I am not anymore, and I try to say it as little as possible now, even in memory. He would slide the pancake onto my plate with a small flourish, and I would eat it, and I would feel the strange, dull ache of being handed my own name in golden brown edges. It wasn't that I hated the name. I did not know yet that I was allowed to. It was more that every time I heard it, a very quiet part of me flinched, the way you flinch at a photograph in which your eyes are half closed, thinking, that isn't quite me, please don't frame it. But of course they framed it. They framed all of it. There were pictures of me in a small navy suit at Marley's first communion, pictures of me holding a soccer ball I did not particularly want to hold, pictures of me with a plastic tool bench my grandfather had picked out with real love in his heart, and I smiled in all of them, because smiling was the thing you did. Marley, though, was different from the rest of them, and I want to be careful here, because the temptation of a story like this is to make one person the villain and one person the saint, and life is never that clean. Marley could be impatient with me. She could roll her eyes when I trailed after her. She could slam her bedroom door when she wanted her friends to herself. She could tease me in a specific and merciless way that only older sisters can. The kind of teasing that stings for a decade and then softens into something almost like tenderness in memory. But Marley also noticed things. She noticed, for example, that I lingered in the doorway of her room whenever her best friend Priya was over and they were experimenting with makeup at Marley's little vanity. She noticed that I did not linger in the same way when her other friends came over to play video games in the basement. She noticed the difference, and she did not name it and I did not name it, but the noticing itself was a kind of quiet gift, though I would not understand that until much later. Priya was 2 years older than me and had been part of our household for as long as I could remember. Her family lived 4 streets away, and she and Marley had bonded in the 2nd grade over a shared obsession with a series of horse novels, and by the time I was old enough to pay attention, Priya was practically a second sister to Marley, and something more complicated to me. She was warm in a way my family was not. She hugged. She said your name a lot when she talked to you, as if she wanted to be sure you knew you were the one being addressed. She had thick dark hair that she wore in a long braid down her back, and she smelled like coconut oil and green apple gum, and she was the first person outside my immediate family who ever really looked at me, not through me. When I was 7, she taught me how to French braid a doll's hair by sitting behind me on Marley's bed and guiding my fingers over the strands, and I remember being terrified that Marley would come in and see me doing it, and also terrified that Priya would stop. The first time I understood in a small conscious way that other people had opinions about who I was supposed to be, I was in the 2nd grade, and a boy named Ross in the row behind me leaned forward during quiet reading and said, in a whisper that was not really a whisper, "Why do you sit like a girl?" I had not known until that moment that I sat like anything. I had just been sitting. But after that day, I sat differently. I widened my knees. I let my arms sprawl. I practiced at home in front of the hallway mirror how to occupy a chair the way boys were supposed to occupy chairs, and I got quite good at it, and I hated it, and I did not know I hated it until many years later, when I sat down on a park bench in my late 20s in a soft skirt for the first time in public and let my knees fall naturally together and felt something in my spine unclench that had been clenched since I was 7. My mother, I think, sensed something early, though what she did with that sensing was complicated. There was a Halloween, I must have been 8, when Marley was going as a fairy and had a leftover set of translucent wings from a dance recital. I asked, in the smallest voice I had, if I could be a fairy too. My mother paused, holding a paper towel and a can of window cleaner, and I remember the pause more than what she said, because the pause was the whole answer. Then she smiled a careful smile and said, "Oh, honey, boys can be all sorts of things. How about a wizard? We can make you a beard out of cotton," and she said it kindly. She said it without any cruelty at all, but I understood, in the way children understand things they cannot articulate, that a door had been quietly closed. I was a wizard that year. The cotton beard itched. Marley was a fairy and won a prize at the school parade, and I stood next to her in my black robe and clapped, and I remember watching her wings catch the gymnasium light and thinking, with a kind of grief I had no name for, that some things were for her and not for me, and that I should learn to be okay with that. For years I tried to be okay with that. I threw myself into being the kind of son my father seemed to want, which was not the same as the kind of son my father actually wanted, but I did not know the difference. I learned to talk about baseball scores, though I did not care about them. I learned the names of tools in his workshop. I stood next to him on Saturdays and handed him wrenches when he asked, and he ruffled my hair in a proud, distracted way, and I would go up to my room afterward and lie on my back and feel oddly hollow, as if I had performed a play in a language I did not speak and the audience had liked it, and I was the only one who knew I had been faking the accent. I was a good performer. That was the danger of it. Nobody, not even I, could always tell. The first real crack in the performance came when I was 11, and it came, as many things did, through Marley. She had just started high school and was newly interested in fashion magazines, and she used to spread them out on the living room floor on Sunday afternoons and dog-ear the pages. I would pretend to be reading a comic book on the couch, but I was really watching her hands, watching the pages, memorizing the outfits she circled. One afternoon, she left the room to take a phone call, and I slid off the couch and knelt by the magazines and started slowly turning the pages, careful not to fold anything, careful not to leave a trace. There was a photograph of a woman in a long green wrap dress standing on a stone staircase, and I looked at her for a long time, and I felt something I did not have the vocabulary for, a soft and painful envy, a wanting that had nothing to do with the woman herself, and everything to do with the shape she was allowed to be. I heard Marley coming back down the hall, and I scrambled back to the couch and picked up my comic book, and my heart was beating so loudly I was sure she could hear it. She sat back down on the floor and glanced up at me and said, "You okay?" And I said, "Yeah," and she looked at me for a beat longer than she needed to, and then went back to her page. She had seen something. I know now that she had seen something. But she did not push, and I have thought many times about what a gift that restraint was, even as I have wished, in weaker moments, that she had pushed and saved me a decade. Middle school was when I first tried, in earnest, to grow out of what I was starting to suspect about myself. I made a private, silent bargain with some vague authority in my own mind. If I could just be more of what everyone expected, if I could get taller, get sharper, get louder, get more interested in the things boys were supposed to be interested in, the strange feelings would go away. This was a theory I held for years, and it was wrong, but it was the kind of wrong you can only discover slowly. I joined the track team because running felt like a way to outrun something. I let my hair get shaggier because that was what boys were doing that year, and I did not tell anyone how much I hated the way it fell into my eyes or how, at night, I would sometimes gather it back with one hand into a low ponytail against my scalp and look at myself in the bathroom mirror and feel a small, guilty relief, a sense of yes, there, that, before letting it drop and going to bed. Priya was the one who kept accidentally undoing my performance. She came over less often once she and Marley were in high school, and each time she came, she seemed more grown, more herself, more of what I understood, without being able to say it, that I was afraid I would never be allowed to become. Once, when I was 12, I passed her in the upstairs hallway on the way to the bathroom, and she stopped and looked at me and said, "Oh, your hair is getting long, that suits you," and then kept walking. It was a 2-second comment. It was probably not even a comment she remembered making. I remember it the way people remember weather on the day their life turned. I went into the bathroom, closed the door, sat down on the closed toilet lid with my hands in my lap, and cried without making any noise because someone had, however briefly, seen me as something other than the shape I was supposed to be and had been kind about it, and I did not know what to do with the kindness. There was a period from about 13 to 15 that I now think of as my long attempted burial. I decided, in the private courtroom of my own head, that whatever this thing was inside me, it was a defect, and it was my job to bury it deep enough that no one, including me, would ever have to look at it again. I stopped watching Marley do her makeup. I stopped lingering. I refused, on principle, to try on any of her things when she and my parents were out, even though the impulse would sometimes rise up in me so sharply that I had to physically leave the house and walk around the block to shake it off. I dated a girl named Hannah in 9th grade for 4 months, and she was sweet and freckled and confused, and I was sweet and terrified and confused, and when we broke up she said, with more insight than a 15-year-old should have had, "I don't think you wanted a girlfriend. I think you wanted a friend," and I said, defensively, "That isn't fair," and she shrugged and said, "Maybe not, but I don't think I'm wrong." I lay awake for weeks after that, replaying her voice. The house I grew up in had a full-length mirror on the back of my parents' bedroom door, and it was the only mirror in the house tall enough to show a person from head to foot. When my parents were out at their monthly bridge night, and Marley was at Priya's, I would sometimes go into their bedroom, close the door, and stand in front of that mirror for long stretches of time. I never took anything out of my mother's closet. Something in me could not bear the thought of being caught doing something so specific, so I never did that. But I would stand there in my ordinary clothes and I would try, silently, to imagine myself differently. I would tilt my head. I would soften my shoulders. I would try to see what a slightly different version of me might look like, and each time, without fail, I would eventually make eye contact with myself in the mirror and feel a wave of shame so hot it would send me backing out of the room. I would smooth the carpet where I had stood. I would close the door exactly the way it had been. I would go back downstairs and pour myself a glass of water and drink it slowly, as if drinking water were proof that I was still ordinary. The first person outside my family who unknowingly gave me language for what I was feeling was a substitute English teacher in 10th grade, a soft-spoken woman named Ms. Aldana, who filled in for 2 weeks while our regular teacher was on maternity leave. She had us read a short story about a person who had lived for years under a name and a role that did not fit them, and then she asked us, quite gently, what it might feel like to know something true about yourself and to be unable to say it. The other students said the expected things: tension, sadness, frustration. I did not raise my hand. I did not speak the entire 2 weeks she taught us. But I remember going home that afternoon and sitting on the edge of my bed and understanding, for the first time in a real way, that there was such a thing as a mismatch between an inner truth and an outer life, and that other people, invented people in stories, had known this feeling and had put it into words and had been believed. I did not tell myself yet what my mismatch was. But I stopped believing I was the only one carrying something. The second half of high school passed in a kind of controlled numbness. I got good grades because good grades were another way to be praised for being the son my parents thought they had. I applied to universities far enough away that I could reinvent myself, but close enough that I could come home for holidays and pretend nothing had changed. Marley was already at college by then, studying to become a physical therapist, and Priya was in nursing school 2 states away. My childhood house grew quieter. My parents began to sound different at dinner, more like co-workers than partners, and I noticed this the way you notice the water level going down in a familiar pond, gradually and with a small ache. The night before I left for university, my mother sat on the edge of my bed the way she used to when I was small, and she smoothed my hair, and she said, "You know, you don't have to be anything in particular out there. You just have to be honest with yourself." And I remember looking at her and feeling both loved and terrified, because I did not know if she was telling me something she meant abstractly or something she had suspected for years. I said, "Thanks, Mom," and she said, "I mean it," and then she kissed my forehead and left. And I lay in the dark for hours wondering what she had really been saying, and I was too afraid to ever ask her. At university, in the anonymity of a new city, I started, very cautiously, to loosen the belt of my performance. Not in any way anyone could see. I did not come out to anyone. I did not, at that point, even know what I would have been coming out as. But I let myself read things. I would sit in the back corner of the university library and pull memoirs off the shelves, memoirs by people whose lives did not resemble mine on the surface, but resembled mine underneath, and I would read them for an hour, and then reshelve them and go about my day. I started noticing my own gestures again the way I had noticed them at 7, but now with a kind of curious tenderness instead of shame. I would watch my hands as I stirred pasta on my dorm room hot plate and think, that is a nice way of holding a spoon, and I would surprise myself with the thought, and I would not chase it away. The turning point I did not see coming happened in my second year, at a small holiday party in a friend's apartment. Someone had brought a box of vintage clothing that a grandmother had passed down, and everyone was rifling through it, laughing, taking pictures, trying on sequin jackets and old fur collars as a joke. In the middle of the box was a soft, dove-gray cashmere cardigan with pearl buttons, and someone tossed it at me and said, "This one is definitely yours," and I caught it out of the air, and I froze for a second, and then, because everyone was laughing, I laughed too, and I put it on, and it fit, and the sleeves fell in a certain way over my wrists, and the collar sat in a certain way against my neck, and something inside me went very quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when someone finally stops talking and you realize how much noise there had been. I made a joke. I posed for a picture. I took the cardigan off carefully, folded it, put it back in the box. My friend saw me looking at it and said, "Do you want it seriously? Take it, it looks good on you." And I said, "Oh no, I couldn't." She pushed it into my hands. Anyway, that cardigan lived in the bottom of my closet for 4 years before I ever wore it again, but I could not throw it away. I could not even give it away. I do not know how to explain that except to say that some objects become, for a while, the only proof you have that a particular version of you exists. Around this time, Marley began dating the man who would eventually become her husband, a soft-eyed carpenter named Owen who had grown up in a house full of sisters and moved through the world with an unusual gentleness for a man his size. The first time I met him, he was standing in my parents' kitchen helping my mother chop parsley, and he had a dish towel over one shoulder, and he was listening to my mother tell a story about her aunt with the kind of full-body attention that made my mother's whole face brighten. I liked him immediately, though liking someone immediately made me nervous, because it usually meant I was going to disappoint them eventually. Owen shook my hand and said my old name, and I felt the flinch, but he also looked at me like a person, not like a category, and that mattered. Later that night, Marley cornered me in the hallway and said, "So, what do you think?" And I said, "He's kind," and she nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, he is," and then, after a pause, he asked me earlier what your pronouns were, and I did not answer him because I did not know what you'd want me to say. I remember the wallpaper behind her head. I remember the framed picture of the two of us at ages 6 and 3 that hung on the wall next to us. I remember trying to breathe evenly. I said, "I don't know either." She said, "That's okay, we can not know together," and she squeezed my arm and went back down the hall, and I stood there for a long time with my hand on the doorframe, feeling something shifting under my feet that I had spent my whole life trying not to feel. That conversation was the first time anyone in my life had gently allowed me to not know, and I want you to understand what a strange and generous gift that was, because so much of my earlier life had been organized around the demand that I know who I was, know what team I was on, know what I wanted to be when I grew up, know how to answer when someone at a family barbecue asked me if I had a girlfriend yet, know how to laugh at the jokes uncles told. Marley, without making any speech about it, was the first person to offer me the sentence, "We cannot know together." I don't think she realized at the time that she had loosened something in me. Or maybe she did realize. Marley often knew more than she let on. In any case, from that night forward, something in the way I carried myself began, very slowly, to change, though I would have denied it if anyone had pointed it out. I moved through my early 20s in what I would now call a long and quiet negotiation with myself. I graduated with a degree in graphic design and got a job at a small studio in a city 3 hours from my hometown, and I lived alone in a 5th-floor apartment with slanted ceilings and a window that looked out over a bus stop. I let my hair grow cautiously past my ears, past my jaw, telling myself and anyone who commented that I was just too busy to get a haircut. I bought a pair of women's jeans in a thrift store one autumn, telling myself it was because the cut was more comfortable, and I wore them only at home for 6 months before I gathered the courage to wear them to the grocery store. Nothing happened at the grocery store. No one looked at me. No one said anything. That absence of reaction was, I think, one of the most important experiences of my life. The world had not ended. The universe had not registered a complaint. I had walked into a store, bought bread and eggs, walked out, and been left alone, and I had felt, for the entire 12 minutes, like a slightly truer version of myself. I remember standing at the crosswalk on the way home, holding my paper bag, and understanding that the world I had been afraid of my whole life was mostly not paying attention. But I was not brave yet. Not really. I was experimenting the way a person tests a frozen pond, one foot, then another, then back. I still went home to my parents' house for Christmas, as the same shape they expected. I still wore the same clothes there, still answered to the same name, still let my father clap me on the shoulder and call me son, and each visit I would feel, on the drive back to my apartment, a specific and difficult grief, the grief of leaving a place where I was loved as a person I no longer was, if I ever had been. I would drive with the radio off and think about how much love in my life was directed at a version of me that I was slowly, secretly outgrowing, and I would wonder if the love could survive the outgrowing, and I would arrive at my apartment and stand in the hallway for a moment before turning on the light, gathering myself. Marley, though, kept noticing. She would call me on Sunday evenings, ostensibly to chat about her week, and she would ask questions that other people did not ask. Not intrusive questions. Just questions like, "Are you eating enough? Are you sleeping? Is there anyone you want to talk about? Any friends I should know about?" How does it feel where you are? She never asked me directly whether I was okay in the biggest sense, and I think that was on purpose because she understood, somehow, that if she asked me the biggest question, I would deflect. But by asking me many smaller questions over months and years, she slowly built a bridge that I could, when I was ready, cross toward her. The bridge got crossed a little at a time. Once, on the phone, I mentioned, offhandedly, that I had been growing my hair. She said, "I've noticed in your profile picture, it looks nice." That was all. But that was enough, for that week, for me to look at myself in the mirror the next morning with slightly less hostility. Another time, I told her that I was thinking about painting my apartment a soft green color, and she said, "Oh, I bet that will be beautiful. You have always liked soft things." And I remember sitting on the floor of my kitchen with the phone against my ear and repeating that sentence to myself later. You have always liked soft things, because it was the first time anyone in my family had described me as if softness were not a failure. The night I called Marley to tell her, in a stumbling and half-coherent way, that I was starting to think I might be a woman or something like a woman, or at least not the person everyone thought I was 26 years old, sitting on the floor of my apartment with my back against the couch. And I had a full glass of wine on the coffee table that I never took a sip from because I was too afraid the wine would make me unable to say what I needed to say. Marley listened. She listened the way she used to listen when we were kids, and I would come into her room after a nightmare, and she would lift her comforter so I could crawl in beside her without ever making me explain the dream. She said, when I finally ran out of words, "Thank you for telling me." Then she said, "I have known something for a long time. I did not know what it was. I just knew it was there." And then she said, "Whatever this ends up looking like, I am on your side and I want to say something else, but only if you want to hear it." I said, "Tell me." She said, "I don't think Mom will be surprised. I don't know if she'll be graceful about it, but I don't think she'll be surprised." My mother, I understood then, had been holding a door slightly open for years without either of us walking through it. Telling my parents was harder than telling Marley, and it did not go the way I had rehearsed. I drove home on an ordinary Saturday in April, and I sat with them at the kitchen table where I had eaten cereal every school morning of my childhood, and I said what I had come to say, and my mother put down her mug very carefully, as if it were made of something more fragile than ceramic, and she looked at me and did not speak for what felt like a full minute. My father, to my surprise, was the first one to speak. He said, in a voice that I had almost never heard from him, the voice of a man who did not know what he thought but was trying to be honest anyway, "I don't understand this. I want to understand this. Can you help me understand this?" My mother put her hand over his and said, without looking away from me, "We love you. We are going to figure this out. Please do not disappear on us." I said, "I am not disappearing. I am arriving." It came out of my mouth before I knew I was going to say it. My mother's eyes filled up. She said, "Then help us learn who you are. I want to be very careful here because it would be easy to compress the next 2 years of my life into a montage, and life does not really work that way." It was not smooth. My father struggled. There were phone calls in which he called me by my old name and then apologized, and then called me by my old name again 5 minutes later, and there were dinners at which my mother tried very hard and used my new name so many times in a row that it began to sound like a word she was translating from another language, and there were long silences in the car on the way to the grocery store when I visited home, silences in which I could feel him trying, and it moved me even when the trying was not enough. There were also moments of unexpected grace. My father, one summer evening, sat next to me on the porch swing and said, out of nowhere, "I keep thinking about that Halloween you wanted to be a fairy, and how I let your mother handle it, and I've been wondering if I should have said something then." I said, "Dad, I was 8. He said, "I know." He said, "I still wonder." I did not know what to do with that, so I put my head briefly on his shoulder, the way I had not done since I was small, and he did not move for a long time. Priya, I should say, was one of the first people outside my family I told, because Marley, without asking me, had already begun preparing the ground. Priya called me on a Tuesday afternoon out of nowhere and said, "I heard you are becoming yourself, and I just wanted to say I love you, and I have loved you your whole life, and none of that changes." I sat on my kitchen floor and cried into the phone, and she waited, and then she said, "When you are ready, I want to take you shopping, only if you want, no pressure." And I said, "I would love that." And she said, "Okay, I'll wait until you say when." She did wait. It took me another 6 months. When we finally went, she drove 3 hours to meet me in my city, and she held my hand in a department store dressing room while I looked at myself in a plain black dress and did not know what to say, and she said, "You look like the person I always half suspected you were," and I thought, so many people have half suspected and no one, including me, dared to say it out loud. Marley and Owen got engaged on a rainy weekend the following spring, when I had been living as myself, publicly, for a little over a year. My hair was long by then. My voice had shifted, not because of anything medical yet, but because I had stopped forcing it low. I had a job I liked and a small circle of friends who had only ever known me the way I actually was, and I was slowly, tentatively, learning that some kinds of ease were possible for me that I had never believed were possible. Marley called me the night Owen proposed, and after we had done all the excited talking, she said, "I want to ask you something, but I want you to think about it, not answer right away." I said, "Okay." She said, "Will you be my maid of honor?" I did not answer right away. She had known I wouldn't. I sat on my bed with the phone against my ear, and I looked at the ceiling, and I felt every version of me I had ever been standing quietly in the room, the child at the baptism watching my sister's hair being pinned, the 8-year-old wizard, the 11-year-old on the couch pretending to read a comic book, the 15-year-old with a burial project, the 20-year-old in a cashmere cardigan, the 26-year-old on the kitchen floor, all of them looking at me, waiting. I said, "But Priya." I said, "Priya has been your best friend since you were 7. Marley said, "Priya, and I have talked about this." Priya said, and I am quoting her exactly because I want you to hear it in her voice. She said, "That role belongs to your sister." She said, "I have been at her side since we were children, and I want to be at her side that day too, but not in that title." Marley's voice broke a little. She said, "I am telling you this because I want you to understand this is not a gesture. This is not me being politically correct. This is not me trying to prove something. This is me telling you that you are my sister, and there is only one maid of honor, and it is you." And I sat on my bed, and I did not say anything for a long time, and Marley said, "Take your time, take a week, take a month, take however long you need." I said, "I don't need a month." I said, "Yes." She said, "Oh, thank God. I have been so nervous," and she laughed a wet, shaky laugh, and I laughed too, and we stayed on the phone for another hour talking about nothing important, and I remember when I hung up, standing at my kitchen window and looking down at the bus stop below, and watching a woman I did not know sit down on the bench and open a book, and thinking, we are all just quietly becoming who we are one small evening at a time. That is why, months later, standing in Marley's kitchen at midnight with my cold cup of chamomile tea, I understood what she was really doing when she said the words "maid of honor" out loud to me a second time. She was not correcting the record. The record was already clear. She was giving me a public shape for something that had always been true, quietly, between us. She was telling me, in front of every ghost of every family Christmas and every awkward Thanksgiving toast, and every relative who was going to have to update their vocabulary, that I was her sister, and that I always had been, even in the years when neither of us knew how to say it, even in the years when I was pretending, even in the years when she was watching me pretend and choosing not to name it, protecting me until I could name it myself. She was saying, "This is who you are to me, and I will not soften it to make it easier for anyone else." And I want to say, honestly, that in that kitchen I understood something else too, something more painful and more precious. I understood that Priya's love and Marley's love had, together, done something for me that neither could have done alone. Priya had let a role go so that Marley could give it to me. Marley had received that letting go with the humility to pass it along. Between them, they had built a small, invisible architecture of grace around my life, and I had not known it was being built until it was already holding me up. The wedding itself I will not describe in detail because a memoir like this is not really about the wedding, it is about the long walk toward being able to stand at one. I will tell you only a few things. I will tell you that when I got dressed that morning in the bridal suite, with Marley sitting in her robe on the bed and the makeup artist gently doing my eyes, my mother came in with a small velvet box and put it in my hands. Inside was a pair of pearl earrings that had belonged to her mother, my grandmother, who had died when I was 11. My mother said, "She would have wanted you to have these, and I want you to have them, and I want you to know that I have been holding them for you for a long time without knowing exactly why." I put them on. My hands did not shake. I looked up at her in the mirror, and she was crying, And I said, "Thank you, Mama." And she made a small sound and turned away for a second to gather herself. And Marley, from the bed, said, "Both of you, please. If you make me cry, my mascara is going to become a personal problem." And my mother laughed through her tears, and I laughed, and Marley laughed. And for a moment, the three of us were just women in a hotel room getting ready for a wedding. And there was no other, older story on top of us. I will tell you that Priya walked toward me during the reception with a glass of champagne in each hand and gave me one and said, "To you?" And I said, "To you?" And she said, "Don't be silly. This day was never mine." And I said, "Priya, some of this day was yours before I even knew I was allowed to have any of it." And she looked at me for a long moment and said, "Okay, then to us." And we drank. And neither of us really said anything after that, because we did not need to. I will tell you that my father, halfway through his speech as the father of the bride, glanced over at me where I stood at the head of the wedding party in my long gray dress with my grandmother's pearls at my ears, and he lost his place in his notes, and he looked down, and he swallowed, and then he looked back up at the room and said, "I have 2 daughters, and I could not be prouder tonight of either one of them." I want you to know that he had never said that sentence to me before. He had never rehearsed it with me. He had never told me he was going to say it. He just said it, into a room full of people, some of whom had known me only as the person I used to be, and he said it as if it were the most obvious sentence in the world. And I looked down at my shoes because if I had looked up, I would have shattered. And Marley, next to me, took my hand and squeezed it hard and did not let go for the rest of the speech. I want to tell you what I understand now, from the vantage point of a few more years, standing on the other side of that wedding and of many quieter days that came after it. I understand that identity is not a single moment of announcement. It is a long, patient practice of allowing yourself to be known. I understand that the people who love you well are not always the ones who guess the truth first. They are the ones who make room for the truth when it finally arrives, and sometimes, if you are very lucky, they are the ones who kept the room ready for years without telling you. I understand that Marley was doing that. My mother, in her complicated, imperfect way, was doing that.
Priya was doing that.
Even my father, in his silences and his awkward apologies and his eventual sentence about 2 daughters, was doing that. I understand that I spent the first half of my life trying to become someone who could be loved by the people around me, and the second half of my life discovering that the people around me had been waiting, some of them without even knowing it, to love the person I already was.
I
understand that the child on the bathroom rug watching her sister's hair be pinned did not do anything wrong by wanting what she wanted. I understand that the 8-year-old wizard was not a failure of a fairy. She was a fairy in a costume that itched. I understand that the 15-year-old with the burial project was not weak or dishonest. She was a frightened girl doing her best to survive in a world that had not yet given her the words. I understand that the version of me who stood in front of my parents' bedroom mirror when the house was empty was not a shameful secret. She was a rehearsal, a soft, private rehearsal of a self who would one day walk down an aisle behind her sister and hold a bouquet and be introduced by a slightly nervous cousin as the maid of honor. Please welcome her. The truth I could not have told you when I was younger, the truth I can tell you now, is that I did not become someone new. I only stopped performing someone I was not. There is a difference, and it took me most of my life to feel it in my body. The strange, quiet grief of transition, the part no one warned me about, was not the grief of losing a self. It was the grief of realizing how long I had been kept from a self that had been there all along, waiting patiently, folded up small, in the way children fold themselves small when they are hiding in a game, and beginning to suspect that no one is looking for them. Someone was looking for me, it turned out. Several someones. They just did not know for a long time what they were looking for, and neither did I. I still keep that dove-gray cashmere cardigan from the college party in a drawer, though I hardly ever wear it anymore because it is a little worn at the elbows and because I have other clothes now, clothes I chose intentionally, clothes I bought as myself. But I take the cardigan out sometimes and hold it in my lap, and I think about the girl who caught it out of the air in a stranger's apartment and put it on as a joke and felt something in her spine unclench, and I say, quietly, to that girl, you were right. You were not making it up, you were not being dramatic, you were you, and I am sorry it took me so long to trust you. And then I fold it and put it back in the drawer, and I go on with my day, because that is what women do, they carry their old selves gently and go on with their days. If you are still with me, if you have walked with me through this long remembering, I hope that some small piece of it has landed in you kindly. Maybe you have your own cardigan in a drawer. Maybe you have your own sister, or your own Priya, or your own mother holding a velvet box she has been keeping for you without knowing why. Maybe you are still in the part of the story where you are standing in front of a mirror in a quiet house, not sure yet what you are looking at. Whatever part of the story you are in, I want you to know that from where I am standing now, on the far side of a long walk, I can tell you that the walk is worth it. Not because the ending is a triumph, because it is not really. The ending is only this: that I am a woman in her 30s who lives in a small apartment with soft green walls, who calls her sister on Sunday evenings, who wears her grandmother's pearls on important days, who has chosen once over a lifelong best friend, not because she was more deserving, but because a sister had decided long ago what she was going to call her, and had only been waiting for her to catch up. That is the whole story. That is what I finally wanted to tell you. Thank you for sitting with me while I told it. I hope, wherever you are tonight, that someone in your life is already saving a title for you that fits who you really are, and I hope, when they offer it to you, you have the courage to say yes.